Picture a skinny kid in Liverpool, school bag on his shoulder, swapping chords with an older boy he looks up to. That kid is George Harrison. The older boy is Paul McCartney. They geek out over skiffle and rock and roll records, trying to copy licks from American 45s. Paul is confident, quick with ideas, already a perfectionist even as a teenager. George is quieter, soaking it all in, fingers working overtime to keep up. It's not long before Paul brings him to John Lennon's group, the Quarrymen. John thinks George looks too young, so they try something unusual, a second audition on a bus. George leans in and nails a tricky lead line. That's the moment the door swings open, and the kid who's too young becomes part of the story that will swallow the rest of his life. From day one, though, he's stepping into someone else's house. Lennon and McCartney are already building an empire inside the band, writing constantly, pushing the vision forward, steering the ship. George watches, learns, and at first he doesn't seem to mind. He's the apprentice in a room full of masters. The press eventually gives him a neat little label, the quiet one. Cute for headlines, sure, but not the whole picture. To friends, the silence reads heavier. A guy who's starting to feel boxed in, his ideas being waved away, his instincts second-guessed. Especially by Paul, whose gift for taking charge can, depending on where you're standing, look a lot like taking over. Now, imagine bringing a new song to the band and watching it sit on the bench while the big partnership runs half a dozen Lennon-McCartney tunes through the machine. Imagine hearing your guitar parts picked apart so often that you stop trusting your hands. Years later, George would say, very calmly, that those years eroded his confidence as a guitarist. He didn't accuse anyone of bad intentions. He didn't need to. You could hear it between the lines. When someone else is always driving, it's hard to learn how to trust your own steering. By the time they hit the White Album sessions in 1968, that quiet pressure had turned into something harder. George had grown massively as a songwriter. He had melodies, chords, and a spiritual angle that set him apart. But the room hadn't grown with him. Paul, laser-focused on details, was unofficially calling the shots. John was drifting, distracted by love and looking for new forms of freedom. And George? He was done being furniture. The follow-up project in early 1969, what became Let It Be, put the whole messy dynamic on display. Cameras were rolling, and what we see isn't a band in sync. It's four guys trying to pretend they still want the same thing. There's a moment fans always talk about. Paul, trying to shape a song, pushes George toward a specific guitar part. George, calm as a lake, basically says, "I'll play the part you want or I'll sit out, whichever you prefer." Not angry, not dramatic, just exhausted. That line lands like a white flag. It isn't a tantrum. It's a man clocking the truth. I'm not being heard. And within days, he actually walks. January 10th, 1969, George quits. He does come back after some tough conversations and new terms, but the air has changed. Everyone can feel it. Here's the kicker. Give George room, and he blossoms immediately. Something, Here Comes the Sun, songs that hold the same status as the band's most beloved hits, written by the guy who'd been told implicitly and explicitly to wait his turn. It proves the point he'd been making without saying it. He didn't need a babysitter, he needed space. But even as the music shines, the relationship keeps fraying. That partnership at the center, John and Paul, was never just dominant. It was two suns in one solar system. Most things either orbited them or burned up trying. The band's breakup in 1970 wasn't a surprise. It was a slow-motion crash that finally stopped moving. For George, it wasn't just a business split. It was the end of a relationship that had defined his voice, and too often muted it. He answered the breakup with the tidal wave of All Things Must Pass, an album stuffed with ideas he'd stockpiled, songs that had been waiting in the wings while the Lennon-McCartney factory ran overtime. Fans heard joy and sorrow and a new kind of spiritual reach. They also heard barbed edges. One track, Bright on the Surface, sounded to many like a clear message to the band's control freak tendencies, especially Paul's. Another song a few years later took the legal battles that followed and turned them into a blues, complete with a sly eye roll at the whole mess. Paul's decision to dissolve the business partnership in court may have been necessary, but to George it felt like a final stamp. We are not a we anymore. People close to him saw the toll. His then ex-wife, Patty Boyd, would later share that George never really gelled with Paul's personality. You could tell from the way he came home from sessions, tired, irritated, like he'd spent the day squeezing himself into someone else's blueprint. They tolerated each other. That was the word that kept coming up. Not hatred, not war, tolerance. Which is a strange thing to feel toward a person you once took a long bus ride with just to show off a guitar lick. Even when the band tried to reconnect, the old grooves reappeared. In the mid-90s, the surviving trio reunited to finish a couple of John's demos. For fans watching from the outside, it felt like a miracle. The Beatles together again, kind of. Inside the room, memories rustled. George had little patience for being steered. Paul tried, as ever, to shepherd the music toward a polished finish. And longtime collaborators noticed the body language, eye rolls, clipped jokes, that familiar push-pull between two men who never learned a comfortable middle. Paul later admitted it. They got on each other's nerves, same as always. They got through it, but through it is not the same as over it. So, did he ever truly forgive Paul? Here's the honest answer. It depends on what you mean by forgive. If you're picturing a big dramatic scene where decades of tension dissolve in a single hug, probably not. These were two men carved by very different instincts. Paul's gift is driving a song to the finish line. George's gift is leaving space for the soul of it. Those traits clashed in the crucible of the Beatles. They made masterpieces. They also made scars. But if forgiveness looks like letting go of the need to win, seeing the human being across from you and choosing kindness anyway, then yes, there's evidence they got close. The late life visit, the softer jokes, the refusal to keep score in public. That's reconciliation in real life. Imperfect, quiet, and not made for headlines. And maybe that's fitting for George. He wasn't built for the fireworks. He was built for the afterglow, the feeling a song leaves behind once the amplifiers cool down. The kid who once needed a bus ride to prove he belonged ended up writing music that taught millions of people how to breathe. He learned, sometimes painfully, that you can admire someone and still need distance from them. He learned that you can be in the biggest band in the world and still feel unheard. And he turned those lessons into melodies that feel like sunlight on your face. If there's a moral here, it's not pick a side, it's make room. The Beatles didn't always make enough room for George Harrison. When they finally did, or when he took it for himself, he gave us songs that belong in the same breath as the band's greatest hits. Look, I'll put it to you. When you watch that studio footage, when you hear those interviews, do you think George and Paul found peace at the end? Was it a handshake, a look, a shared joke that said, "We're okay"? Or was it something smaller and maybe more meaningful, a decision on both sides to let the past sit where it is and to keep the love anyway? Drop your take in the comments. This story isn't just music history, it's a case study on creativity, ego, and the quiet power of boundaries. If this deep dive hit you in the feels or taught you something new, show some love. Tap like, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next untold backstory. Tell a friend who still argues about which Beatle was the best songwriter. And hey, while you're at it, go re-listen to something, Then Here Comes the Sun. Hear the gentleness, yes, but also the steel. That's George Harrison in a nutshell. Soft voice, unshakable core. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll see you in the next one.